Okay, welcome back everyone to plenary mode. After 45 minutes of intense discussions in the breakout sessions, I did breakout hopping from one to the other, and so I have glimpses of all the discussions, and they were very interesting, very diverse, and so in the end, lots of goodies are to come out of this. And we'll hear from all the 6 moderators from each breakout session, 2 minutes each. So really it is elevator pitch of 2 minutes on what were the main points discussed or conclusions. And let's start from architecture and MVE. Jean-Francois, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so 2 minutes, I'll try to be fast. So first, rather than discussing each and every component of the MVE, I think there was an agreement at least that the fact on the components that were put in one of the slides of the architecture presentation, so they were okay. But the positioning of the MVE was discussed. First, the view of the engineer, who said that there is not enough detail yet in order for me, an engineer, to contribute to the MVE. So the answer here is that we're in the infancy of this discussion, and whoever is a member of an infrastructure, let's say an IT manager in any of the infrastructure, needs to engage now in order for the MVE to go from an overall goal to technical specification, right? So that it's clear that we are at that stage where we will have to move into a more detailed description of the various components of the MVE. The second part of the discussion was that there are lots of infrastructures that have already faced all those problems, AI, PID, and so on. And they have lots of experience, and why reinvent the wheel? So the answer here was the discussion, and the answer was we want to federate infrastructure. So all progress, all good things that are coming from infrastructures, and EOS need to leverage upon, to use them, and federate those gems into something which bring value to the user. And then there were concern. The third concern was, well, we need to deliver, otherwise funders or will not trust us. So yes, there is a tension here between designing the MVE in a way that will have the best potential on the one hand, and on the other hand, having success stories and results that will convince funders to continue to fund. So there was those various view angles on the same problem, the definition of the MVE, from the engineers, from the infrastructure manager, and from the funder perspective. So that was the discussion of the architecture.
Thank you very much, Jean-Francois. Françoise, FAIR Breakout 1.
You have a slide here. The letters are very small, but they have a heavy weight in discussions. The discussion was very, very interesting. And I think we have more things taken in notes that will be transmitted to the project. So these are only a few points. The fact that it's interesting and useful not to reinvent the wheel when one begins now, especially for the small infrastructures. There are different levels of interoperability, and this has to be fully taken into account. You can use subclusters to define different levels progressively. There is a strong need for collaboration to share best practices, implement them, find solutions. And there is a need for support to EOSC, and there is also a need that the communities work themselves, in particular to define their standards and the practices they need for their own requirements. On the research infrastructure side, it was shown that it's extremely useful to have a policy and a framework which explains both to the research infrastructure itself and to its users in terms of what to do with data. And and we also found that it's really useful that everything is shared, including these policies. The things that there are many examples of best practices now, and that it's useful to share the examples. And it was mentioned that publishing in journals is useful to convince yourself of what you have done, how you have implemented FAIR for your community, convince yourself, convince your colleagues, think about what you have done, and also in the end, convince your boss and share with the others, basically. So again, document and publish everything. It was also noted from the discussion that the FAIR principles are very useful to guide work and to help people to understand what to do, but there is a need for guidance, and there would be a need for guidance on each criterion linked to the FAIR principles, how to implement them, and what to do when you are in your own case compared to people who are in other contexts. So guidance is needed, and in general, it does not exist. The publications were mentioned both as, in some case, a kind of data, and also that you have to publish data in synergy with publications, so interact with the publishers. The specific difficulty of interoperability was mentioned, of course, with these different levels of interoperability, as cited before. And one has to deal with complexity of the data before even reaching the interoperability layer, especially in some disciplines. So we can finish with recommendations, which are recommendations to EOSC and to EC. There is a need to have a two-way dialogue between EOSC and the stakeholders, in particular the research infrastructures. Support is needed because culture, there is a need to change culture, there is a need to define standards, there is a need to implement fairness, and there is a need to talk to the community. So there is a need for support. And it's not always easy in the framework of the current usual calls from Brussels. And again, guidance is badly needed. And changing culture is difficult, and you cannot do it from scratch, and you need support for that.
Thank you very much, Françoise. FAIR breakout number 2, Andy. Two minutes.
Unmute, you can hear me. Let's see if I can share.
Yes, we can hear you.
I wanted to just share the screen because I have some slides as well. You see this? So
yes.
Okay, so yes, so we also similar to Françoise, we had very interesting discussion and a lot of notes were taken. People were communicating via online documentation doc, and Sophie helped a lot with this. It was clear that the people present there were, I would say, some of them really expert in FAIR, and there's a long, the people have been working towards FAIR or working, everyone, there were no one was not working towards FAIR. And there's some people who are very advanced and others who are still progressing towards that. The most difficult issues, let's say, they face are the I and the R, which is not surprising. So interoperability, which also makes data reusable, but it's very hard to measure. Incentives, this was discussed. Journals asking for DOIs were definitely something that would help and is helping to give scientists some incentive. And in some communities, they're working on tools which are mining data publications to actually give credit back to people when data is reused. We discussed briefly on licenses, where CC BY 4.0 seems to be the most commonly used, or at least the one that was discussed. And CC0 can be sometimes used also for metadata. In some countries, we noticed that FAIR is not considered a priority, so there were quite a few statements in this direction. And one of the reasons which was given was that also data sets are still not considered first-class citizen in terms of research outcomes. So people are, let's say, funding agencies or national agencies are still measuring publications more. It's difficult to measure what is fair, so requiring something to be fair by a funding agent, we still are difficult to measure because it's such a vast concept. It's not something which is as simple as open or not open. And what helps with this is certifying repositories and maturity models. Of course, FAIR is made to be clear, it's not always open, but in that case, at least the metadata should be open. Scientists, we also discussed our scientists are aware of this, and this is still very low on many of scientists, especially we notice there's a difference between older and younger scientists. And also in terms of decision makers, the value, added value of making data fair has still to be, we're still in the process of proving that this is worth it. And there was a good comment saying that not all data are equal, so one should not try to make all data fair, but the most important data fair. That's it.
Very good. Excellent and timely. Ornella, FAIR breakout number 3.
Showing now, yeah. We had some slightly different results compared to Andy. It seems that we also had a different sample. Now, we all agree that going towards fair data is necessary, but it will take time. So this is a gradual process, and that it will also imply additional costs, including, for example, human resources. These additional costs are usually underestimated. They are still not, may not be well known. We had some participants that gave the example of funding agencies that are developing KPIs related to open science and fair data to motivate research organizations to implement these principles. So discussions are ongoing because there is the view that a reward or penalty system may help to introduce fair data, but they need to be very careful on the fact that the indicators used are the appropriate ones and that they are not, let's say, misleading. So we can achieve the goal of promoting the use of fair data. When talking about fair, there are costs involved, but we also need to consider the cost of not having fair data. So the benefits we are not having. These benefits have not been well identified or quantified. And this is something that needs to be measured in the future because it will probably increase the reusability of data will increase as we will move in time. To move, everybody agrees that to move, to make EOSC a useful infrastructure, we must move to fair data, but data needs to be of high quality. There is no point on having a bunch of data that cannot be reusable because it's not of good quality. And research infrastructures play a key role into certifying the quality of data, but they need to have the means to do so. Sorry. Now, regarding the policies, there are in some research infrastructures, there are not concrete incentives in place for scientists to apply FAIR principles. Mainly, there are, let's say, there is still the mentality of the publication, so this needs to be slightly changed. And also, it is needed to introduce in the training of young scientists in the education, because there is not a full awareness from the scientific community about the importance of FAIR. So there need to be paths, education paths introduced in early careers. And we had also a very nice example of how this was achieved in a country. They introduced in the university curricula for postdocs a course on FAIR data. And some research areas are, let's say, a little bit more advanced in collaboration across institutions to move together towards FAIR. So there is already some degree of coordination in communities on standards. But we need to be pragmatic and move step by step, because it is clear that we need to achieve, let's say, a full maturity of FAIR, but this process will require time. And yeah, also here we mentioned the interoperability, which is challenging, especially when regarding historical data. So the compatibility with whatever exists. And this will require a lot of time and a lot of resources to achieve compatibility with data that already exist. That's it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. And then moving on to rules of participation. And Wolfram, we're all ears.
Yeah, it seems that my video has been stopped by the host. That's what it says. So you just hear my voice, I hope at least.
Yes, we can hear you.
Now I'm allowed to show. We had a very interesting discussion about the question how the rules of participation will be affecting the thematic research infrastructures and ESFRI as a whole, and the other way around. So how can the thematic research infrastructures or ESFRI as a whole can affect the rules of participation in the future? I have to invite you to a short thought experiment. So think about the situation that the rules of participation as they are now, they're very broad, will be handed over to the EOSC Association in December. And then going forward, the EOSC Association will be responsible for developing the rules of participation. And imagine that the rules itself, they might stay abstract, but there will be very specific implementation guidelines. Maybe there will be implementation guidelines for individual thematic research infrastructures. So for Human Brain Project, or for Elixir, or for Clarion, Daria, or whatever. So individual implementation guidelines for the rules for individual research infrastructures. How should that happen? Should that not happen? That was one of the questions that we posed. And if so, and if that happens, how can the EOSC Association organize an editorial process that is also developing these implementation guidelines for the rules of participation, or an update process, let's say. So we have some results to share. And I hope you can see my screen. Can you?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. So the questions that we posed, I just explained. I will not repeat them at this point. What we discussed, and we had a very good discussion. We had not too many people, but we had representatives of the research infrastructure. So really we included or could discuss the perspectives of thematic research infrastructures, disciplinary research infrastructures, and did so. So there were mixed views about this question, whether an individual thematic research infrastructure should have an individual implementation guideline, so an individual interpretation, let's say, of the rules. But if so, and I think that's an important message for ESFRI to take forward, of course, there is something like an organizing role in there, or a question for ESFRI: how could ESFRI participate in this process, that there are individual inputs, and how can be made a link between ESFRI and the EOSC Association so that rules and implementation guidelines for the rules can develop over time. Most felt that the EOSC Association will have the final responsibility for the rules going forward. And there was also a strong agreement about the question that there should be a representative input for the thematic research infrastructures in the EOSC Association. And there is, of course, the underlying question: is the membership model sufficient for representing the research infrastructures in a way, for example, in this context, in the rules of participation going forward, being developed, being adopted for individual research infrastructures? Is the membership model that the EOSC Association has sufficient, or do we need a liaison, for example, like ESFRI, that is organizing the responses, having a stronger voice basically in the organization? We cannot answer these questions at this point, but I think it's very important to pose them. You will also find them in a slightly different form in the questionnaire for the breakout sessions, and you can vote on that among all the other questions. What you see, we only collected 9 responses. As I said, we were not representative definitely, but you have an indication here. Would you suggest to develop individual ROP implementation guidelines for thematic infrastructures? The view is very, very split. Do you think ESFRI should have an organizing role in preparing individual ROP implementation guidelines? There, many people said yes. So if there would be such a process of having implementation guidelines for thematic research infrastructures, then yes, ESFRI should take a role. Many people felt that the responsibility lies in the association, as already said, and a very strong vote on the research infrastructures being represented in the process of developing the rules of participation going forward. That's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Wolfram. And skills and training, Irina Kushma, the rapporteur, will give us the report.
Thanks. I think Wolfram should stop sharing. Thanks. It's coming in the presenters mode. Just a second. So we picked up on the discussion about disciplinary skills versus interdisciplinary, and we consider interdisciplinarity as a skill set that could be supported by EOSC. And we also discussed a bit about EOSC enabler role and how social and community enabling plays an important part of that. So that's why we added communication and community building as a skill set that is important for EOSC. We also talked about coordination of training programs, competence centers, and how important it is to link trainers. And by linking trainers, we mean across research infrastructures, but also with institutions and on the national level and on European level. And we touched upon briefly on training as being part of sustainability, and MV. And there was this message that EOSC will be empty unless we train people, and awareness is really step 0. And we also use Mentimeter and just a couple of slides. So these are some of the EOS actors that participants of our breakout considered most important for their research infrastructures, research organization. And it doesn't include researchers, policymakers, and citizens, because we consider them as a given. And some more about coordination, how coordination is really needed at all levels. And we also talked briefly about importance of training catalogs for EOSC and how we can make sure that all training materials that we produce as research infrastructures or projects are really searchable and available, and what kind of quality stamp we could add. And that's it from me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to all 6 presenters of the reports on what happened to the during the breakout sessions. Tremendous richness of topics, as you see, some coming up in different breakout sessions, especially the interoperability issue popping up again and again, and then it will be with us for much time to come. And tremendous involvement of the research infrastructures, the ESFRI research infrastructures, but also others, and all of them engaged in all aspects, participating in the MBE, creating FAIR data, and so on and so forth, at different levels of progress, and so on. So that is the status of the technological developments around the EOSC. Lots of things, all the pistons are operating, lots of things are happening, and a lot more to come until we finally reach the MVE, and then we build the rest of EOSC as time comes. I want to thank everyone for this session, and I'm closing now this session. And Miriam will take over for the wrap-up. Thank you all very much. I thank the panelists and the rapporteurs and moderators, and above all, the entire audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Yannis. I cannot put on my camera because I'm...
Yanni?
Okay, yes, it seems to work. Thank you very much, Yannis, for handing over to me. So we come now to the wrap-up of the first day of a very successful and very rich day, as Yannis already said before. I will give you a wrap-up of session 1, and then the wrap-up for session 2 will come from Yannis. And I prepared some slides together with Sarah for session 1. And here they come. Go and share the screen with you. So on the EOSC partnership, so the EOSC partnership and the new ASBL or legal entity is only preliminarily assessed and partly adequate to face the challenges, and also thematic RIs are only partly represented. This was a come out of the breakouts. Then it became clear, and was clear already, that EOSC should be inclusive, including both small and large research infrastructures, but also other communities. And this came up several times, that universities should also, of course, be part of EOSC. So the research infrastructures are very interested to join the EOSC Association, but it became clear during the discussions today that more information might be required. So for small entities, it's a bit harder to see the clear added value to join the association. And so better awareness is needed here to explain this, and showcase will benefit that in the longer term. then I think a lot of entities heard today, or research infrastructures, that the observer membership of the EOSC Association is a possibility, and this might be considered for these smaller entities, might be a solution. Then thematic clusters have played a key role in getting together RIs from the same domains, but are also working on common goals across domains. And what became also clear during the breakouts and the discussions today is that collaboration with the HPC and Euro HPC community is very important for the future of EOSC. And then I would like to hand over to Sarah for the SFRI wrap-up.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. So drawing through the different kind of groups that had been discussing the SRIA, there were three main areas that I pulled out. I think one of the themes that came out very strongly was putting research communities at the center. So we need to develop the vision and priorities for EOSC in collaboration with the research infrastructures, and make sure that what we're doing within EOSC really meets the actual, practice and needs of those research communities. One of the ideas that had come out of the group I was in was this idea of having a very strong forum so that we're making sure we collect user needs and engage with research communities and take their inputs. So whether we have some form of stakeholder forum like we've had now, or if we find some way that the research communities are reflected in the governance, I think it's important that whether they're in the association or not, we make sure they have a very strong role. And there are examples about how we could share expertise around things like IT and standards. If we move to the next slide, the second thing that came out quite strongly for me was that we need to address the gaps and imbalances. So research communities are at very different stages, different levels of readiness, and we need to accept and embrace that. We need to support the development of standards, and we need to be more balanced in our investments. So maybe we need to direct more funding to research communities to help them develop their standards, or to support where the data sharing and data management is happening in practice. And we also need to be flexible in our approach. So the SRI as a living document is something that needs to adapt in light of this dynamic environment. The gaps that were picked up specifically were around disciplinary standards, the software, and the workflows. And then the third point that came out, there were some areas where clarification was needed. So in the breakout summaries, there'd been questions about what exactly is expected of research infrastructures, why they should engage, what's the added value. So I think the value proposition here is important, and thinking about what assets are going to be made available through EOSC and how. And there were some questions in my group as well about what the marketplace is, who does it serve, how's it going to work? And I think there's still a lot of kind of open questions, and it's not entirely clear exactly how EOSC will work. So there are things we definitely need to improve in this next stage of delivery.
Okay, thanks very much, Sarah. So then I will go on with the Iron Lady document and the Sustainability Working Group. So it's clear that the EOSC Association membership fee does not cover the cost of operating the European Open Science Cloud, of course. And costing is focused on the operation of EOSC and not on the development of EOSC. And transition from the current state to the first implementation of the minimal viable EOSC, there's a need to move away from project funding. That became very clear. Research infrastructures that have already open resources, meaning no AI, they remain open. And this will not be changed. It's clear that a consensus on an interoperable metadata framework is needed. And as discussed already in other sessions, there is a consensus that an interoperable metadata, there's a copy-paste mistake here, sorry for that. And so on this metadata framework, there's also we need to agree with another forum such as RDA, and again federate with national thematic infrastructures via such a framework. And also again it came up that not only RIs but also universities should have a strong engagement in EOSC. So that was the wrap up of session 1. And then I would like to hand over to Yannis and to Juan for session 2. Please, Yannis.
Yes, well, there was just a small wrap up from the breakout sessions just a while ago, and we don't have any slides due to lack of time, but I think we can give the gist of what was discussed in session 2. So Juan, share with us your impressions.
Thank you, Yannis. Yeah, so this is very hurried because this has just happened, but I've tried to see some subjects that came out across the different breakouts, across different topics. I picked out 4 things. The first one is that there are 2 sides to an argument about learning from experience. We heard, we have to learn from experience. We have that the RIs have a lot of experience and we mustn't reinvent wheels. But on the other hand, we also heard in the architecture group that the problem we are trying to address with EOSC is a new problem. It's about federation, it's about cross-disciplinary, it's about bringing a much broader spectrum of people together than has perhaps been done by the individual research infrastructures and the infrastructures. So I think that's something that we have to think about, is how do we have the conversation across the board range. Second point that struck me was the governance is really important. We had governance in session 1, but it came up several times in session 2 as well. And by governance, I mean how the decisions are going to be reached. It comes up in architecture and comes up in criteria for FAIR. It came up in ROP a lot about how we take the next steps in developing the ROP and who we involve. And also on this line came up that a lot of the decisions that have to be taken globally, because the research is happening globally. EOSC has to interact, has to support global research communities as well as European researchers, or support European researchers in their global work. So that was another thing, and RDA has been mentioned several times as a vehicle to enable that. Of course, I would say that. The third point was about what the next steps are. In architecture, we heard that we have to move from goals to technical specifications. In rules of participation, we discussed that the current rules really are just aspirational principles, directions of intent, but more detailed specific rules are going to have to be made for the specific resources and specific types of participation. So I think we have to recognize that we're on a long road. We're at a certain point where we have made some good progress and we have something that is now existing, and we have a lot of projects all working on developing that. But really, it'll be a while before we get to the full value back from the investment. And we have to recognize that as we move in refining goals into technical investment. Final point was really around stakeholders and what's the best way to involve them. How we balance listening to discipline-specific or thematic-specific things and cross-disciplinary things. If you saw the first of those pie charts in Wolfram's presentation back from the ROP, it's really interesting that it split 3 ways, and it was basically around the role of ESFRI versus the thematic infrastructures, and there was a broad range of opinions, almost an equal split 3 different ways on that question. And I think that's something that's probably true across the board, that there are many people with different opinions. So we have to find a way to do that. Different opinions across the different thematic areas, also different opinions across different countries. And it came up in training, which I think was a really good point, that cross-disciplinariness itself is actually a specialist subject. And we need to perhaps think of it as a thing in itself, not just something that can be done as an add-on by a lot of disciplinary specialists. And here we think about standardization, which as always you have to balance doing something narrow and quick versus something doing very broad, which will take longer. And we have to find the right balance between those two. So those were my 4 points that I drew out from the discussion. I'm sure there were lots of other interesting things too, but that was my take on it.
Thank you very much, Juan. You caught quite a few of the key points that I had in mind and some that I didn't. There are two that I want to bring up that made an impression on me, and are in the same flavor that you mentioned, that things that were supposed to be in session 1 came up in session 2 again and again. And one of the issues for me was the issue of the people. Although this was the session on technological development, the people came up again and again in all breakout sessions and in all presentations. Everyone should be involved in shaping up the MVE and contributing to it. People need to understand what FAIR is and how to make their data fair, what are the incentives to put for researchers and scientists to make their data fair, and how to engage the publishers to understand what this means and interact with them to come up with the right structures so that data is published in a fair way. Who should be involved in the rules? Who are the stakeholders, not just organizations, not just at the legal level, but individual scientists, research infrastructures should be involved in shaping up the rules of participation. And that should be in a dynamic process, because people change and science change, and science is diverse. And of course, that the training, it's a major element. It requires training, not just formal training, but training also the politicians, training the funding agencies, training the policymakers, in order to think of this new way of approaching science. So it is even technology, which has a whole bunch of challenges, don't get me wrong, is intimately, for any progress in technology and for technology to have impact, the people are the key element that we have to pay attention to. And the second issue that struck me, didn't strike me, but I found it worth mentioning, is the issue of cost, which also came up in a lot of the technological discussions. Not just developing technology costs, but also how do you sustain the entire operation. And you cannot expect just the fees to cover. And it's not just sustaining the development and the maintenance of the technology, but even the training that was discussed before, of educating the researchers, the scientists, and stakeholders that I mentioned. It requires, it's costly, and there has to be a mechanism so that these training costs, must be sustained. So people and costs were the two things that I wanted to put next to the points that Juan mentioned as the key things that came out around all the discussions in session 2. As Juan said, there is a long way to go, but it's a way that we have started. It's a trip that has started, and its destination, or even the trip towards whatever the destination is, sounds exciting. So that's from session 2. Back to you, Miriam.
Thank you, Yannis. Can you put my camera on again? Doesn't work.
The
yes.
tech team, please.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for this excellent wrap up in such a short time. very interesting. I think we really learned a lot today, and I'm very excited about the outcome of the conference. And it would have been, of course, much nicer if we would have all been face-to-face in Greece. And I heard from Fotis that it's fantastic weather there. So yes. That's a pity, but nevertheless, I think we had an excellent first day of the workshop. And I would also like to thank the Athena team, Tassos and Fotis and the Stress-Free team for the excellent organization and to make this all technically possible, because that was a real challenge. So yeah, I would like to thank you all again, and we would see each other tomorrow for the second day. And I'm looking very much forward. And I would like to hand over to Yannis. Maybe you also want to say a last word of this day.
No, it was a very rich day from beginning to end. I've also been trying to follow the discussion in the chat, and it's a really heated discussion in the good sense. Yes, I agree. No, I disagree. What about this? And so on and so forth. And now that the quality is being discussed with Jan and Francoise and Carol and everyone, I think the material that we have will be food for thought for many decisions to be made in the times to come. And I wish to change a little bit. I wish you were all here to host you in Athens, but you know, sometimes this is not possible. But we give you a rain check for the next opportunity, the third, the fourth, the fifth workshop. We'll be glad to organize it in Athens. And I want to thank also my team at Athena that has done a great job coordinating all the breakout rooms and coming back and so on and so forth. Thank you all guys from me as well.
Okay, great. Yes, Tasso, Fotis, sorry.
Yeah, there is a questionnaire with all the questions from the breakouts that is available to be filled in, not only by you who are participating in the breakouts, but also your colleagues. I think we need to raise this also tomorrow morning during the plenary. And the link was sent in the chat. If you don't, it should be also available in the website. If you don't find it, you know, just send an email to info and we will send it back.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Fotis.
Welcome.
Okay, well, then I would close for today, and happy to see you all again tomorrow at 10 o'clock on the second day of our workshop. Have a nice evening. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
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 Bye-bye, everyone.
Goodbye, take care.